So one of the things when I was reading evolutionary psychology and trying to parcel out the differences in sexual attraction markers between men and women, I'll tell you a brief story as an intro to this. So when I was an undergraduate at the University of Alberta, I had some success with women, but not much. And then I went to McGill and I was a graduate student, and nothing changed really in the couple of months between when I was a, senior undergraduate in Alberta and when I was a low-level graduate student in Montreal. But how attractive women were to me changed a lot. And I thought, well, that's not you, that's something about status. And I already knew that the evolutionary theory there, and that women are more affected by, let's say, social status in relationship to sexual attractiveness than men are. But then I thought that through too, and I thought, no, women use status as a marker for the ability to gain status in novel environments. It's something like that. And so like an expensive watch or something like that, or a nice suit, shows that you have acquired resources and hints that you still could even if things fell apart. So it's not mere power or even resources, which it's often parodied at and sometimes understood as. It's a proximal marker for something much deeper, which is somewhat akin, I think, to what you're talking about with regards to the male bowerbird. Is that way off? So let me ask you about that in terms of personality then, because sure. I've been thinking a lot about the sex and gender issue, the idea that there's an infinite number of genders. And I like to give the devil his due as much as I possibly can. And one of the things you do see in the personality literature in psychology, which is reasonably well developed, right? I mean, we have a pretty good model of human personality, 5 basic personality traits. Maybe they're subdivisable into 2 sub-traits each, so that's 10. It's 5 dimensions of variability. That's a lot. Reality only has 4 dimensions of variability. So what you see is that there are reliable differences between men and women in aggregate in personality. And one of the big differences is that women are about half a standard deviation more sensitive to negative emotion. And they're about half a standard deviation more agreeable, so more compassionate and polite. And it's not that hard to point out that, well, that might be a logical consequence of sexual dimorphism. So women should be a bit more sensitive to threat because they're a bit smaller, but also that they have to, I don't think human adult female personality is adapted to human adult females. I think it's adapted to female infant dyads. And a female infant, because here's why. You don't see those personality differences emerge till puberty. Now, that's also when you get sexual dimorphism, but boys and girls under 12, 11, they're not different in terms of sensitivity to negative emotion. But then puberty hits and the transformation seems permanent. And so it makes sense to me that a creature that has an infant is going to be more sensitive to negative emotion, and also what has to be more agreeable, more compassionate, because, well, it's an infant, right? And compassion is the right emotion for someone under 9 months of age. It's just compassion because, well, they're born so young, right? We have a very short gestation period, and so they're completely helpless. So of course it's compassion. Okay, so now having said those differences exist, and there's some other ones, but they're more trivial. There are lots of women who have male personality patterns. So you find women who are low in negative emotion and low in agreeableness. They're quite masculine that way. And there are men who are quite feminine in their personality characteristics. And then you could also say, well, insofar as personality is associated with gender, well, there is tremendous 10-dimensional variation. And so the idea that gender is fluid in some sense and that it's, not exactly tied to the underlying sexual structure, there's some, when it's not pushed too far, when it's not political in its intent. Well, and I think that your notion of niche transformation, niche switching there. So imagine that partly what the woman is trying to do is use markers of proximal success as an indicator of niche switching capacity. Now, they're inadequate markers, and that's partly why they can be criticized, and they're no more accurate than the claim that just because you're rich, you're good. But but status is not exactly wealth, although wealth is a proxy for status. Status is more subtle. But symbols of wealth are pretty good instantaneous proxies for status. like they're subject to all sorts of flaws and they're not sufficient, but, you know, you have to screen most people out, so you need simple markers to begin with. So Heather, let me ask you, how do you view, both as someone who's female and as someone who's an evolutionary biologist, how do you conceptualize the difference in status hierarchies in human females and human males? I'd really be interested to hear that. Like, if you look at human social hierarchies, and this is true across the animal kingdom, and then you rank order individuals in terms of their relative status, even in relatively non-social creatures that have to occupy the same territory, those that have the best local niches have offspring that are much more likely to survive. They have much lower mortality rates. And then there's something else too that psychologists have figured out that I think is right, that has a biological underpinning, which is that your serotonin system is more effective at modulating your negative emotion given a certain level of stress the higher you are up in the social hierarchy, because you're actually safer. And so part of what that implies, and this just blew me away when I sorted it out, was that when you go after someone's beliefs and they've used their beliefs to stake a claim to a position in a hierarchy, you're attacking the structure that modulates their sensitivity to negative emotion. And you know, if you're hypersensitive to negative emotion, you hyper prepare physiologically so much that you die way earlier. So this isn't trivial. And it isn't like the terror management theorists think that, you know, your beliefs somehow regulate your anxiety directly. It's no, you have a set of beliefs that gives you a stake to a claim in a status hierarchy. And so that's what we do as professors, right? We say, well, look, we have this knowledge, and that's why we get this niche. Well, then I attack the validity of your knowledge, then I make you out to be one of those fly-in bowerbirds that just ripped off the status hierarchy. And then that interferes with your emotional regulation. That's like, so let's switch you. If you think those terms are importantly different, and if they are, why, and what they both mean if they're different. So let's start with that. One of the things that was really awful about that was that it was really hard on the high-performing graduate students, you know, because they felt that even being in the same category as the people who weren't working hard and pulling their weight devalued what they were doing, you know, and that's exactly right. And so this is also why there's a conscientiousness trait and an agreeableness trait. Because conscientious people judge you on your accomplishments, right? They don't give a damn about your feelings, not a bit. It's like, are you doing the work or not? Whereas agreeable people think, well, you know, your mother's sick and, you know, you've got a bunch of family problems and